Namaskar and good evening to all of you. So I request the guest speaker of this evening, Dr. Shashi Tharoor Sahitya to come on the dais. So on behalf of everyone in the Academy and also this literary faculty, I would like to welcome the Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji with a bouquet of flowers. Respected Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji, eminent Indian English writer and scholar, writers and scholars who are assembled here, media personalities and honorable friends of Sahitya Akademi. I am glad to welcome all of you for this year's Foundation Day lecture by Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji. It was on this day, 62 years ago, that Sahitya Akademi was established by its founding fathers Jawaharlal Nehru, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, Maulana Azad, etc. Well, it has been a long journey. It has been a very fruitful and fulfilling journey nevertheless. We have come a long way. Today, every year we organize more than 400 literary programs in 24 Indian languages across the country and throughout the year. We publish around 400 books every year and again in 24 Indian languages recognized by Sahitya Akademi. We organize and participate in close to 200 fairs and exhibitions through the length and breadth of India. Today, we are India's premier literary institution. But none of this would have happened without the support and help of the writers community from all over India. There can be no two options about the fact that it is writers who are the flesh, blood, bone and soul of Sahitya Akademi. They have made this institution what it is today. As I stand before this August gathering, remembering the journey of the Sahitya Akademi, I salute every single writer from across the country. As I remember the writers as core of Sahitya Akademi, my mind and heart also goes towards all the workers of Sahitya Akademi, and without doubt, they have been vital cogs in the wheel. Not only my present set of colleagues, but also every single worker who worked from inception and strengthened every step of Sahitya Akademi through their hard work and dedication. My salutations to all of you, my friends. We launched Foundation Day lectures recently in 2013, and this is the 4th Foundation Day lecture. These lectures, like the famed Samvatsar lectures, provide a chance for the literary connoisseurs and laymen alike to listen to eminent scholars, thinkers, and greatest minds of our time. These lectures also provide opportunity to Sahitya Akademi to reflect on the literary climate in the country and also to fix for itself Academy's place in the country from time to time. A thought that is often attributed to Socrates: a day spent without self-examination is a day wasted, can be applied not only to humans but also a living institutions like Sahitya Akademi. These lectures are part of that process for self-introspection, self-analysis and self-determination by Sahitya Akademi. The greatest minds often act as reflecting mirror, and that is the reason why we invite eminent scholars and thinkers to deliver Samvatsar and Foundation Day lectures. As I stand before this august gathering, I feel humbled and yet at the same time very proud. A mere glance at the list of doyens who adorned this institution, nurtured it, and are still taking care of it as if it is their own baby, is enough to make us feel perfect. Some of the men who took first steps in Sahitya Akademi are doyens in true sense of the word, and the whole list gives me goosebumps. For want of time, I am just mentioning few names. The first General Council of Sahitya Akademi, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, C. Rajagopalachari, K. M. Panikar, K. M. Munshi, Vallathol Narayanan Menon, Humayun Kabir, Sunita Kumar Chatterjee, Uma Shankar Joshi, Jainendra Kumar, Neelamani Phukhan, Hajari Prasad Dwivedi, Masti Venkatesh Iyengar, Veer Singh, V. Raghavan, K. V. Puttappa, Mahadev Verma, D. V. Gundappa, Rajsekhar Bose, Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, and Banarasi Das Chaturvedi. I feel proud and humbled when I think of the pioneers of Sahitya Akademi, and every one of them was worth the gold. Friends, this evening's guest speaker, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, as you know, is a writer, scholar, politician, and former diplomat. Dr. Tharoor was completed a PhD in 1978 at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at the Tufts University, and he was also awarded an honorary D.Litt. by the University of Puget Sound and doctorate honoris causa in history by the University of Bucharest. He is also an award-winning author of 15 books of both fiction as well as non-fiction. He served as a Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. And Dr. Tharoor was a pioneer in using social media as an instrument of political interaction and currently has 3.88 million followers. During his nearly 3-decade-long prior career at the United Nations, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, and administrator at the highest levels, serving as Under Secretary General during Kofi Annan's leadership of the organization. In 1998, the World Economic Forum in Davos named him the Global Leader of Tomorrow. He is also the recipient of several awards that include Commonwealth Writers' Prize, Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, India's highest honor for overseas nationals, Hakim Khan Sur Award for National Integration, Priyadarshini Award for Excellence in Diplomacy, etc. And presently he is the Member of Parliament Lok Sabha and Chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. His works, apart from his absorbing columns in the print media over the years, betray Dr. Tharoor's acumen, very fine writing style, a scholarship covering a wide range of subjects, a sensitivity and a deep understanding of history and cultures. When one goes through his books, from the great Indian novel to India from midnight to the millennium and beyond, to the elephant, the tiger, and the cell phone reflections on India, the emerging 21st century power, and India Shastra, reflections on the nation in our time, one impression will be unmistakable and universal. Dr. Shashi Tharoor is one of the finest minds and a humanist. Dr. Tharoor is a recognized authority on India, especially regarding its recent economic transformation and future prospects, globalization, freedom of the press, human rights, literacy, culture, foreign affairs, cricket, and more, and is a compelling and effective speaker, fluent in English, French, as well as in Malayalam and Hindi. Sir, it is our pleasure to have you in our midst. I am very eager to listen to you like everyone here, and we thank you very much for accepting our invitation to deliver this year's Foundation Day lecture. With these few words, once again I welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji and of course every one of you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivasa Rao, for the very generous and kind introduction that you've given me, and let me also add my word of welcome to the audience this evening. It's very good to see so many of you here on a Saturday afternoon. Esteemed members of the Academy, lovers of literature, ladies and gentlemen. It genuinely is a privilege to be present here today to deliver the Foundation Day lecture and celebrate the over 60 years, 62 I think it is, of the Academy's successful work in promoting Indian literature. In fact, when Dr. Shashi Tharoor mentioned how humbled he was by his distinguished predecessors in the leadership of this institution, I too am humbled by the very distinguished names that have preceded me at this lectern in delivering the Foundation Day lecture. I spoke here once before. I think this building or this auditorium has certainly undergone a renovation since, because my recollection was of 1989 to 90, when I had just published the great Indian novel and was invited to speak about it here at the Academy. And I'm delighted to see it flourishing under new and revived leadership. I'm also particularly gratified that my stint in politics has not yet disqualified me from the fraternity of authors, and you've been kind enough to invite me. The trials and tribulations of politics in India are such that one can never be sure when the voters will return me to the world of literature. So I'm very glad that the exalted literary community has not yet expelled me from this position. But the Sahitya Academy is respected by all as an acclaimed platform for writers and lovers of language. It's gratifying that in these materialistic times, the Sahitya Academy continues to sustain and celebrate the importance of literature and its educative power. Thanks to the Secretary, the leadership and the staff of the Sahitya Academy for their valuable work and for inviting me to be a part of it today. Now, in thinking of my address for today's event, the topic we agreed upon was the anxiety of audience, the dilemma of Indian writing in English. And I cannot help but reflect on how increasingly the political has become the personal and the personal has become the political. Undoubtedly, to speak about this topic requires us to touch upon the overwhelming phenomenon of globalization, definitely a factor that has become a commonplace in defining or redefining many aspects of the human imagination. It's also made many people anxious. The triumphalism and hope that the idea of globalization evoked in the wake of the collapse of communism, the opening up of the world in the early 1990s, have given way in the aftermath of 9/11 and 26/11 and the global recession to a much wider sense of fear and distrust of this idea, from the Occupy Wall Street movement to many of the forces that have begun challenging the entire idea of a world knit together. The rich parts of our planet fear the loss of their preeminence in this globalized world, while the developing countries, or many of them, or many people within them, fear the dawn of another age of economic and cultural domination. One could be forgiven for thinking that fear and insecurity are the most widely traded currencies in the global marketplace today. But that would be a very narrow understanding of globalization, because it would accord primacy to trade and economics alone above everything else, and would ignore the long and distinguished history of globalization in other areas of human endeavor, most prominently in the field of arts, culture, and the human imagination. Consider the possibility that as humanity emerged and evolved into its present form, the central facts of the human condition, birth, life, and death, became, of course, the common canvas for everyone's imagination. This was true across communities and cultures, even as many of these cultures grew in complete isolation from each other, whether it's the Iliad or the Odyssey, the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, whether it's the creation myths of the Bible or the Holy Quran, or those narrated in the legends of the Vikings and the Egyptians, we see at least as much in common as is different and unique. The common strands that run through the earliest stirrings of the human imagination are not without significance. Since the dawn of civilization, globalization as a universal response to the fundamental challenges of human existence has been with us. The ancient mind understood it well, and therefore travel, exile, loss, and belonging have been common themes engaging our imagination since the dawn of recorded human history. The world of trade and commerce are new to the process of globalization. Human imagination got there first. Seen this way, globalization has been an essential part of the human condition. What has changed in our lifetimes is the speed and scale at which it spreads around the world, creating opportunities and shockwaves in equal measure. Globalization has proved to be both a force of convergence and one of disruption. It has brought with it the benefits of an integrated global economy and access to information technology in several parts of the globe. I think today about the forces of globalization irresistibly transforming the world, the information technology revolution that brings to our breakfast tables and our mobile phones as well as our TV screens snippets of information and glimpses of events from every corner of the globe. Today, any individual can purchase anything with a click of the mouse in the comfort of her home, and the pulse of a cursor on a screen can move billions of dollars halfway around the world. These are the forces of convergence that have made the world one village, one market, one audience. But simultaneously, globalization has also unleashed the forces of terrorism across borders. On such searing dates as 9/11 in New York, 26/11 in Mumbai, the depredations of ISIS or Daesh, the wars in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, these are the forces of disruption that threaten to create new divisions between haves and have-nots, between North and South, or perhaps between the West and the rest, between different forms of Islam, and between people of different creeds and cultures and religions. Now, these two groups of phenomena are clearly pulling us together as they drive us apart. Concurrently, they heavily influence the collective imagination of humanity, and through it, the collective memory of what our world has become and what it used to be. So one can ask, has globalization, which has brought McDonald's and Microsoft and Mickey Mouse and Game Boys to every home, also thrust Osama and Obama, Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad into every mind? Has the human imagination become globalized, mainly in terms of this fear of disruption? The creative and artistic impulse must and does fight this colonization of the global consciousness by fear. But for a writer and a lover of ideas to tar globalization as solely a source of human misery would also be an unforgivable failure of the imagination. As a writer and a reader, I'm conscious of how much writing minds, and I'm convinced that ignorance and prejudice remain the handmaidens of violence and disruption. It is as true of terrorism as it is of modern civil conflicts, that men of war prey on the ignorance of the populace to instill fears and arouse hatreds. The Secretary mentioned my United Nations past. Certainly I saw this in Bosnia and Rwanda, where murderous, even genocidal ideologies took root in the absence of truthful information and honest education. If only literature had been allowed to prevail, to open up the human imagination, to enhance understanding across borders and cultures, perhaps people would have realized what unites them and not what divides them, and unspeakable crimes could have been prevented. But I would argue that looking to what unites us is no threat to our sense of what makes us special, our distinctive individual identities. Yet many do feel threatened. The biggest challenge to coexistence within many societies and between societies comes from the assault that the forces of both convergence and disruption make on our identities. In many ways, the fundamental conflict of our times is the clash between, no, not civilizations, but doctrines, between perhaps religious and ethnic fundamentalism on the one hand, and secular consumerist capitalism on the other. The author Benjamin Barber wrote about this. He spoke of the twin prospects facing humanity as jihad versus McWorld. Jihad, as he said, I'm quoting, in the name of 100 narrowly conceived faiths, against every kind of interdependence, against technology, against pop culture, against integrated markets, against modernity itself, unquote, versus a McWorld of globalization run rampant, a world of fast music, fast computers, fast cars, fast food, with MTV, Macintosh, and McDonald's pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park, unquote. And of course, both jihad and McWorld end up by obliterating our most precious possession, our distinctive identity, our sense of what makes us different. Every one of us has many identities. Amartya Sen has argued that ascribing singular identities to people, for example, calling someone a Muslim while overlooking other aspects of his individual makeup. Maybe he's also a Bihari, a cricket lover, a railway user, a classical music aficionado. All these are also parts of his identity, but you call him by just one label. And this, he suggests, leads to the miniaturization of human beings and the belittling of human identity. He has argued passionately against reducing individuals to what he calls a choiceless singularity. Few people, after all, have a choice about the religion they're born into. When all of us have so much more complexity to our identities, sometimes religion obliges us to deny the truth about our own complexity by obliterating the multiplicity inherent in our identities. If instead, identity can relate principally to citizenship rather than to faith, to a land rather than a doctrine, and if that identity is one that can live in harmony with other identities, then we might be able to resist both jihad and McWorld. If we all come to understand and accept that every one of us has many identities, perhaps we can assert each of them without attacking others. As a writer, I'm attracted to what one might call the cultural construct of identity. Now, we must admit that many have seen globalization as a threat to the differentiated cultures of the non-Western world. The great fear is that indigenous cultures will be swept aside in this great tidal wave of MTV, McDonald's, and Mickey Mouse. As an Indian author coming from a country that has globalized more rapidly than most in recent decades, and whose culture has therefore been subject to Western influences of a highly visible kind, I'm particularly conscious of this. And yet I would argue that my country's recent experience with the global reach of Western consumer products demonstrates that we can drink Coca-Cola without becoming Coca-colonized. Despite the fears of many, Baywatch and burgers have not supplanted Bharatnatyam and Bhelpuri in India. Which leads me to the unavoidable question, where does this leave the human imagination, and more specifically, the Indian imagination? Is there a distinctively Indian audience that writers here suffer an anxiety about? Those of you who've had formal training in literary tradition and criticism would have heard of the anxiety of influence, especially in relation to poetry. I would argue that an anxiety exists in every author, not merely in relation to the work of his or her predecessors and the desire to transcend them. Rather, an anxiety exists within each author to find a voice that they can instinctively relate to, and then to find an audience that resonates with that voice and receives it enthusiastically. Perhaps at the risk of modesty, I can address this issue of anxiety in an Indian context most simply through my own attempts at expressing something of the Indian imagination in my fiction. In my first novel, The Great Indian Novel, I reinvented our 2,000-year-old epic, the Mahabharata, as a satirical retelling of the story of 20th century India from the British days to the present. My motivation was a conscious one. Most developing countries are also formerly colonized countries, and one of the realities of colonialism is that it appropriated the cultural definition of its subject peoples. Writing about India in English, I cannot but be aware of those who've done the same before me, others with a greater claim to the language, but a lesser claim to the land. But their stories are not my stories. Their heroes are not mine. And my fiction seeks to reclaim my country's heritage for itself, to tell in an Indian voice a story of India. And let me stress, a story of India, for there are always other stories and other Indians to tell them. Now, how important is such a reassertion of identity in the face of the enormous challenges confronting a country like India? Can literature, for example, matter in a land of poverty, suffering, and underdevelopment? I believe it does. Indeed, that cultural reassertion is as vital as economic development. And moving on to the idea of the anxiety audience, whenever I'm asked, which is more often than I would wish, to speak to a keen literary audience about my writing, I have to approach the task with some diffidence. Writers are supposed to write. We should leave the pontificating to the critics. After all, that's why there is a Sahitya Academy. But once in a while, even writers are forced to think about their craft. I was obliged to do so not long ago when I found myself the subject of a long interview by an academic that included the somewhat startling question, do you think your text belongs to you? I suppose it was inevitable that sooner or later a professor of literature would ask me this postmodernist question. It came from a professor at the University of Burdwan near Calcutta, and faced with his earnest and impressively theoretical approach to my work, I had to explain that not only had I never taken a writing course, I didn't even study literature at university. I had thought that would be like learning about girls at medical school. If you love the subject, don't go and study it in college. And so I was at a bit of a loss for a theoretical sort of approach, because I said that my favorite story of the craft of teaching writing was a story about a British instructor who told his students that actually you could learn writing according to a formula. You want a bestseller and want to ensure commercial success. And this is Britain after all, so he said the story needs to contain religion, aristocracy, sex and mystery, and be brief. Then you'll have a bestseller. So the briefest submission duly came in. It was exactly one sentence long. And it read as follows. My God, said the Duchess of Argyll, I'm pregnant. Who did it? Religion, aristocracy, sex and mystery, all in one sentence. It was stunningly brief. The instruction couldn't be better, so the instructor gave up. And just as well, because for me, writing is a wholly instinctual activity. It is about expressing your most intimate feelings and thoughts, and that is as much you as the way you breathe, the way you walk. Nor would I want anyone else to tell me how to write. In my writing, I've always seen the telling of the tale as being as important to me as its author, as the tale itself. My text belongs to me in the sense that the words I have chosen to employ are the only ones that are authentic to what I have tried to convey. The same story, the same concerns, can obviously be told or expressed by other writers in different ways. My way is the way in which my text has chosen to tell itself through me. And in that form, it belongs solely to me. But I've often felt as a writer that I'm giving expression to something beyond myself, something that emerges from a different realm that I perhaps unconsciously tap into in the act of writing. To that degree, the text is both mine and beyond me, an artifact that emerges like a stream from the ocean of stories that I've been privileged to channel to my readers. For that reason, I'm prepared to accept the notion that my text may contain hidden meanings of which I myself was not conscious in the act of writing. That's certainly true of painters, who may find something emerging from the brushstrokes they've applied on canvas that was not wholly present in their mind when they were wielding the brush. Though text seems more limiting than print, the principle arguably is essentially the same for all art. Of course, the critic who reads meanings the author did not intend is guilty of a form of subversion, and the author is entitled to argue that his text does not support the critic's analysis. There, the onus is on the critic to make his case, and for the fair-minded reader to draw her own conclusions. My 15 books have all been, in different ways, about my personal exploration of India, of the forces that have made and nearly unmade it, of the historical and philosophical traditions that have shaped the Indian identity. While this is explicit, of course, in my 11 books of non-fiction, my 4 books of fiction have also sought to explore the Indian condition, particularly by looking at the kinds of stories Indians tell about themselves, whether the stories of our epics and of our national struggle, as in the great Indian novel that I've already mentioned to you, or the stories of our popular cinema, as in my novel Show Business, or the stories of the identities and histories we construct for ourselves, as in my novel Riot. In all three novels, though each is very different from the other two, it is true to say that the architecture of the book speaks of an India of multiple stories, multiple perspectives, multiple tellers, and multiple truths. Coming back to the great Indian novel, I have rather overtly staked a claim for the tasks of my kind of novel: to affirm and enhance an Indian cultural identity, to broaden understanding of the Indian cultural and historical heritage, and to reclaim for Indians the story of India's national experience and its own reassertion of itself, including the triumphs and disappointments of independence. My story was about the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves, and I am curious in much of my writing about the nature of truth in life as in fiction, in tradition as in history. My second novel, Show Business, also deals with the stories Indian society tells itself and tells about itself, except that instead of the older myths, I've seized upon the contemporary myths invented by modern Hindi cinema. One is always looking for new creative metaphors to explore the Indian condition, and in a country of widespread illiteracy, where popular film represents the primary vehicle for the transmission of the fictional experience, cinema is a particularly useful vehicle for this exploration. In addition, there are some interesting issues that emerge from the subject itself. The social and political relevance of popular cinema in India, for instance, has been dealt with surprisingly little in Indian fiction in English. And the whole process of the manufacture of our modern myths on celluloid is one that I found fascinating as a creative issue in itself. My concern was both with the question, what do these stories, the stories of Bollywood, reveal? And with a distinct second set of questions, how are these stories told? What do they mean to those who tell them and those who see them? How do they relate to their lives? In my novel Riot, the exploration of the build-up to and the eruption of a Hindu-Muslim leads me to raise fundamental questions about the nature of truth, the construction of identity, the invention of and reclaiming of the past, the uses of history, and the various collisions that life offers. Collisions between cultures, between attitudes to life, between ideologies, between religious communities, and between men and women. Unlike the other two, this is not a satirical novel, and so it involved an important departure for me as a writer. Now, I once said to an interviewer, India matters to me, and through my writing I would like to matter to India. The lines have been quoted back to me a great deal. Perhaps they sound more grandiose than I had intended. But the issue of national allegiance, they claim, is real enough. For the task of the writer, if one can say such a thing, is to find new ways and revive old ones of expressing his culture, just as his society strives through development to find new ways of being and becoming. In turn, the challenge of finding these new ways obliges the novelist not just to find new stories to tell, but new ways to telling it, new ways of telling it. For me as a writer, the way I tell the story is as important to me as the story itself. The manner in which the narrative unfolds is integral to the novel, and I hope is as essential to the experience of the reader. I've always believed that, as the very word novel suggests, there must be something innovative in every book I set out to write. So in Riot, for example, I told the story not as a linear narrative, but through newspaper clippings, diary entries, interviews, transcripts, journals, scrapbooks, even poems written by the characters, in using a dozen different voices, different stylistic forms for different fragments of the story. So the structure of the novel served a substantive purpose in pointing to different perceptions of truth and history and different versions of the Indian reality. The narrative suggests, can you hear me at the back? Am I loud enough? The narrative suggests that omniscience is not possible. The reader is in the hands of a dozen subjective narrators and feels that truth is indeed a word that can be modified by a possessive pronoun. There's my truth and your truth, and her truth and his truth. And Riot is also a book you can read in any order, though ideally you should read it from beginning to end, You can pick it up from any chapter, go back or forward to any other chapter, and you will bring a different level of awareness to the story. In so doing, you recreate my text as your own. Now, as a peripatetic citizen of the world for the last 4 or 5 decades, I find myself constantly asked a fourth question with which my more rooted contemporaries have not had to contend. And that's a question, but who do you write for? In my case, the question is complicated by both geography and language. I used to live for almost 2 decades in the United States, and I wrote about India. And I did so in English, a language mastered, if the last census is to be believed, by only 2% of the Indian population. Today I'm an MP from Thiruvananthapuram, but I write in a language that I do not use to address my constituents in Kerala. There is an unspoken accusation implicit in the question. Am I not guilty of the terrible sin of inauthenticity, of writing about my country for foreigners? Now, this question has for many years bedeviled the work of the growing tribe of writers of what used to be called Indo-Anglian fiction and is now termed more respectfully Indian writing in English. Now, this is ironic because few developments in world literature have been more remarkable than the emergence over the last 3 decades of a new generation of Indian writers in English. Beginning, I would argue, with Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children in 1981, they've expanded the boundaries of their craft and of their nation's literary heritage, enriching English with the rhythms of ancient legends and the larger-than-life complexities of our civilization, while reinventing India in the confident cadences of English prose. Of the many unintended consequences of empire, it is hard to imagine one of greater value to both colonizers and colonized. The new Indian writers dip into a deep well of memory and experience, far removed from those of their fellow novelists in the English language. But whereas Americans or Englishmen or Australians have also set their fictions in distant lands, Indians write of India without exoticism, their insights undimmed by the dislocations of foreignness. And they do so in an English they have both learned and lived, an English of freshness and vigour, a language that is as natural to them as their quarrels at the school playground or the surreptitious notes that they slipped each other in their classrooms in English. Yet, Indian critics still suggest there is something artificial and un-Indian about an Indian writing in English. One critic disparagingly declared that the acid test ought to be, could this have been written only by an Indian? His implied question was that if it's something that could have been written by a non-Indian, then it was not authentic at all. For most, though not all, perhaps, of my own writing, I would answer that my words could not only have been written only by an Indian, but only by an Indian in English. I write for anyone who will read me, but first rub off the sandalwood paste caste marks from their foreheads before they enter its portals. And Trivedi goes on, quote, "For this golden gate is only for the deracine to pass through, for those who have erased their antecedents," unquote. It's an evocative image, though I thought the secular Indian state was supposed to encourage the erasure of casteism from the classroom. But the more important point is that writers like myself do share a common cultural matrix, quote unquote, albeit one devoid of helpfully identifying caste marks. It is one that consists of an urban upbringing and a pan-national outlook on the Indian reality. I do not think this is any less authentically Indian than the worldviews of writers in other Indian languages. Why should the rural peasant or the small-town school teacher with a sandalwood-smeared forehead be considered more quintessentially Indian than the punning Stephanian or the Bombay socialite, who are as much a part of the Indian reality? India is a vast and complex country. In Whitman's phrase, it contains multitudes. I write of an India of multiple truths and multiple realities, an India that is greater than the sum of its parts. English expresses that diversity better than any Indian language, precisely because it is not rooted in any one region of my vast country. At the same time, as an Indian, I remain conscious of and connected to my pre-urban and non-Anglophone antecedents. My novels reflect an intellectual heritage that embraces the Mahabharata, the Kerala folk dance called the Otam Thullal, of which my father was a gifted practitioner and which pops up in a couple of my stories, and the Hindi B-movies of Bollywood, as well as Shakespeare, Woodhouse and the Beatles. Why not? As a first-generation urbanite myself, I keep returning to the Kerala villages of my parents, and now as an MP I'm very often in Thiruvananthapuram. So I keep on coming and going back to these roots in my life as in my writing. Yes, I have grown up in Bombay, as it was, Calcutta and Delhi, Indian cities 1,000 miles apart from each other. The mother of my children, who are both here, is half Kashmiri, half Bengali. My own mother, who's also here, now lives in the southern town of Kochi. Now this might be a wider cultural matrix than the good Dr. Trivedi imagined, but it draws from a rather broad range of Indian experience. And English is the language that brings those various threads of my India together, the language in which my former wife could speak to her mother-in-law, the language that enables a Calcuttan to function in Coimbatore, the language that serves to express the complexity of that polyphonous, multilingual Indian experience better than any language I know. As a novelist, I believe in distracting in order to instruct. I subscribe to Moliere's famous credo, le devoir de la comédie est de corriger les hommes en les divertissant. The duty of comedy, of writing, of fiction, is to correct human beings while diverting them. In other words, you have to entertain in order to edify. Now, it's true that to some degree my novels are didactic ones, masquerading as entertainments. I like my readers to work a little for their pleasure, but the pleasure is intended to transcend the work. As for my audience, I have to admit that the entertainment and the edification might strike different readers differently. So, I've pointed out that my first novel, The Great Indian Novel, being a satirical reinvention of the Mahabharata and 20th century political Indian history, will inevitably touch Indians in a way that most foreigners will not fully appreciate. But my publishers in the West enjoyed its stories and the risks it took with narrative form. My second show business did rather better with Western reviewers and readers who enjoyed the way I tried to portray the lives and stories of Bollywood as a metaphor for Indian society. But Indian readers and reviewers said, well, this is something we take for granted every day, and they didn't see the larger purpose. In some of my non-fiction with India from Midnight to the Millennium, for example, I did find an additional audience, Indians outside India, Indian Americans, for example, seeking to rediscover their roots, and so that interest helped the American edition to outsell the Indian one. But then in Riot, I had major non-Indian characters for the first time, Americans as it happens, but it didn't affect the way the book was perceived in India, where it turned out to be a fairly big critical as well as commercial success. Now, inevitably, the English language fundamentally affects the content of each book, but it does not determine the audience of the writer, because as long as translations exist, language is a vehicle, not a destination. You can, after all, access any book in the language that you prefer to read in. Now, of course, there is no shame in acknowledging that English is a legacy of the colonial connection, but it's one no less useful and valid than the railways, the telegraphs, or the law courts that were also left behind by the British, created for their own purposes, left behind for us. Historically, English helped us find our Indian voice. The great Indian nationalist Jawaharlal Nehru wrote his discovery of India in English, so he discovered India in English. But the eclipse of that dreadful phrase, the Indo-Anglian novel, has occurred precisely because Indian writers have evolved well beyond the British connection to their native land. The days when they wrote novels in English, either to flatter or rail against their colonial masters, are well behind us. Now we have Indians in India writing as naturally about themselves in English as Australians or South Africans do. And their tribe has been supplemented by India's rich diaspora, particularly in the United States and to some degree in Britain, which has already produced an impressive crop of novelists and fiction writers with Pulitzer Prizes and National Book Awards to their names. Their addresses don't matter because writers really live inside their heads and on the page, and geography is merely a circumstance. They write secure of themselves and of their heritage of diversity, and they write free of the anxiety of audience, for theirs are narratives that appeal as easily to Westerners as to Indians, to urban populations as to rural populations, and indeed to readers irrespective of ethnicity. In this way, globalization has blurred the boundaries between class, caste, religion, ethnicity, and nationality, expanding the audience and adding other layers to individual identities. I'm proud to point out today to an interesting example of this phenomenon, the evolution of this phenomenon, sitting in the audience, my son Kanishk Tharoor. His collection of short stories, Swimmer Among the Stars, has been accepted for worldwide publication. But as an Indian writer, his work has first been published in India and has received wonderful reviews here. Still, neither his stories nor his readership is confined to this country. One story is indeed about an Indian elephant journeying to Morocco, but another is set in an unnamed Central Asian country where a city braces for invasion by the barbarians. A third is a tale of the last speaker of a dying language in an unnamed land. Yet another depicts the United Nations meeting in space because the planet is drowning as the result of climate change. In other words, his imagination is not confined by either territory nor time, not by his passport and not by his address. Kanishk is now working on a novel set in the 15th century Mediterranean. He is in many ways a writer of the era of globalization, transcending both geography and history. He remains an Indian writer in English, but his writing takes both Indianness and English into literally uncharted waters. Surely that's the whole point about literature, that for a body of fiction to constitute a literature, it must rise above its origins, its setting, even its language, to render accessible to a reader anywhere some insight into the human condition. Read my books, or Kanishk's, or those of other Indian writers, not because we are Indian, not necessarily because you're interested in India, but because they're worth reading in and of themselves. And each time you pick up one of my books, ask not for whom I write for you. So to go back to the question we asked earlier, does my text belong to me? Well, I write, as George Bernard Shaw said, for the same reason that a cow gives milk. It's inside me, it's got to come out. And in a real sense, I would suffer if I couldn't. It's the way I express my reactions to the world I live in, see around me, and try to imagine. It would be as futile to claim ownership of it as for a cow to assert that she owns the milk that she has provided. So no, dear reader, the text no longer belongs to me. It belongs to you. Once again, I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the Sahitya Academy for giving me this wonderful opportunity to step out of my political role for a bit and go back to talking and sharing ideas about the abiding love of my life, literature. Thank you all, and Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir, for a very thought-provoking and depth lecture. I don't have a dare to comment on your lecture, and it is the art of Dr. Tharoor. See, because he kind of hypnotize he does with everyone. That is wherever he gives lectures, it is the thing. Friends, we have a 5 to 10 minutes interaction, but very brief. Sir, will you agree to that?
Of course.
Yeah, okay. Very brief.
Is this working? Yeah.
Yeah, it's working. So, yeah, please. Mike, दे दीजिए उन लोगों को.
If you'd be kind enough to identify yourself so I know what you're doing, whether you're writers, whether you're readers, whether you're students, scholars. Yeah, will you pick the question as...
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I'm a writer as well. I freelance and I write for magazines, etc.
What's your name?
Akshat.
I think better you can stand up.
Okay, I'll just stand. Yeah, so I've been thinking about this problem, which is why I actually came to this lecture. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's clear. So what I think about English in India, I think it's quite problematic, the fact that we use English. So I have two questions for you. Number one, don't you think English has monopolized modernity in India in a way that every high-level literary conversation that we have in India about economics or about ideas, if you want a level of sophistication, you have to do it. You inevitably end up doing it in English. So that I think is a problem with English. So that's one question. The second question is that I have a feeling that as long as we have English, for our best writers, lawyers, bureaucrats, and economists, and all of that, there will always be that thing that, the ultimate acquiescence of the establishment lies not in Delhi or Bombay, but in London or New York. Unless the Guardian or someone reviews your book, you haven't reached the peak. You know what I mean? So just these two questions. And I think there are real problems with the language, like with us using English. Thanks.
Okay, well, I understand your concern, though I don't share it, and I'll tell you why. First of all, we are the country we are. And therefore, because of the multilingual nature of the country we have, the federal system we have, there is no one Indian language that can link us all together, other than an Indian language called English. And that is simply a reality. If you try and speak your sophisticated Hindi or Urdu to a Tamil, you're not going to get anywhere. And ultimately, you're going to leave him either feeling disenfranchised or rebellious, or both. So ultimately, the one great strength that English has, and that for that matter Persian had in the days of the Mughal court, and Sanskrit had in earlier days, and so on, is that it becomes a linked language that everybody has to learn who wants to get ahead at a certain level of society, in order to be able to communicate with others whose core basic vernacular language would be different. So if for 300 years you wanted to be an elite figure in Mughal India, you learned Persian. And arguably in the 21st century, if you want to get ahead in this part of modern India, you want to learn English. Now you don't have to. You can lead very successful and prosperous and even culturally significant lives without learning English. I mean, there's a very thriving instance of modernism. You said, does English monopolize modernity in India? In pretty much every language. I've read translations, say Vilas Sarang in Marathi, or many of the modern writers in Malayalam. You read them in English, and they could have been written by an English writer, except they actually wrote in Malayalam. And don't forget the great Indian capacity for bilingualism. Many who may have imbibed modernity through the English language have gone ahead and expressed it and developed it in their own languages. It's often forgotten, one of the great Kannada writers, Anantamurthy, was actually a professor of English literature. So one cuts across, these are not impermeable barriers, one cuts across these barriers, and it seems to me therefore that it's not a disadvantage. If I make a speech to an audience in my political constituency, I will do so in Malayalam. My ideas may have been informed by things I have read in English. Why not? And it seems to me we should accept this exchange, this coming and going of ideas and language. But on your second point, I'm even more troubled and puzzled because, I mean, if you were right and you needed to be published in the West and be reviewed in the Guardian, how do you account for the phenomenon of Chetan Bhagat or of Amish Tripathi? These guys, any one of their books sells more copies in 2 weeks than I've sold in 25 years of publishing books, right? So the fact is that there is clearly an audience in India for writing that is written for them in a language that would not pass muster, apparently, with English or American publishers, that doesn't get translated into French or German or Italian, but which nonetheless has a tremendous appeal that strums the right chords in the hearts and minds of Indian readers, and that is actually a commercially viable writing career. Both Chetan and Amish gave up extremely successful private sector careers in merchant banking or a commercial institution in order to become full-time writers in English. So very clearly, it seems to me the evidence doesn't suggest that your second point can be sustained. So don't worry so much about it. I think English will find its place and other things will also have their place too. Yeah, I think there's a lady there. Oh, sorry.
मैं कहना चाहती हूँ कुछ.
बताइए.
थरूर साहब, अंग्रेजी से मुझे कोई बहुत ज़्यादा मोहब्बत नहीं है.
अच्छा.
पहली बात ये. लेकिन मेरा नाम पद्मा सचदेव है. मैं डोगरी ज़बान की पोइट हूँ और मुझे लिखते हुए 60 बरस हो गए हैं. मैं 76 साल की हूँ. तो मैं आपको
बिल्कुल नहीं लगता है.
हाँ, शुक्रिया. उतना सा धोखा तो हम दे ही सकते हैं, है ना? मैं आपको सिर्फ ये कहना चाहती हूँ कि मैं अक्सर अंग्रेजी के भाषण सुनने नहीं जाती हूँ, लेकिन आज मैं आई हूँ और सिर्फ मैं ये कहना चाहती हूँ कि शुरू से लेकर अंत तक आपका पूरा भाषण मेरी समझ में आ गया. जीते रहे.
बहुत धन्यवाद. बहुत धन्यवाद. और केरला से आते हुए भी आपका प्रश्न भी मुझे पूरा समझ से करना चाहिए. Yeah, I think there's a young lady there. Who's got the mic? Sorry, if you have somebody has the mic, please go ahead.
Don't you think I am young lady?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely.
सबसे पहले तो आपकी बातें बहुत अच्छी लगी, शुरू से अंत तक जैसा मैम ने बोला। और मेरा नाम रानी श्रीवास्तव है और मैं ऑथर हूँ, हिंदी में कविताएं भी लिखती हूँ, प्रोफेसर हूँ। और मेरा एक छोटा सा प्रश्न है कि आपने बताया कि आपने 4 फिक्शन और 11 नॉन फिक्शन लिखा, तो मैं जस्ट ये जानना चाहती हूँ कि एक क्रिएटिव प्लेजर जो होता है वो आपको किस में अधिक मिला?
Actually, fiction, man. You know, the problem with me is I've never been a full-time writer. I've always had very demanding professional responsibilities, and I would write whenever I could create the time, at night, at weekends, when traveling and so on. Now, that became impossible to sustain as my level of responsibility, first at the United Nations and then in Indian politics, grew, because with fiction, you need not only time, which is scarce enough, but you need a space inside your head to create an alternative world, to inhabit it with people, characters, lines of dialogue, situations that have to remain as real to you as those that you're encountering in your daily life. That became very difficult to sustain when I was doing work that could interrupt me at any time of the day or night, any day of the week, where it was difficult to carve out the time to write full time. And the result of this, very frankly, was that I found it much easier to write non-fiction, because non-fiction is interruptible and fiction is not. If I began a novel or a short story and it got interrupted for weeks on end, when I went back to it, it was difficult to rebuild the glass palace that had been shattered in my head. Whereas with non-fiction, you can reread what you were writing, recollect the train of argument, and continue writing. So 4 of my first 5 books were fiction, and all the rest have been non. So I'm sorry to say that though fiction is creatively far more satisfying, I have to admit that that it has been easier in my life to write non-fiction. I want to go back to fiction. I've had some great fictional ideas bubbling away in my head, and I just find it a bit frustrating that I've not had the time, sadly, to be able to devote to it. One day I will, God willing. Thank you.
A very good evening, sir. This is Navnita. I'm a software developer, but like I write also, and one of my poems was also appreciated by Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam when I was in class 10.
Congratulations.
So my question is, in an increasingly polarized and opinionated society, where everyone have got their own interpretation, how does one ensure that what one writes is not going to offend anybody else? Because people like me are not courageous enough to be in the middle of a storm. So,
well, our society has particularly become a problem in that area, because the tendency of people to claim to be offended has grown dramatically. Certainly it's much worse than when I published the great Indian novel, where I took liberties both with the nationalist heroes and with the Mahabharata itself. And I remember Khushwant Singh, who was then the doyen of Indian writing, devoted an entire column, he had a magazine column in Sunday magazine, which used to come out in 1 full page, and the entire column was devoted to praising this book. But it began by saying, go out and buy this book immediately because it will be banned within a week. And that was the last thing I wanted to hear. But fortunately, he underestimated either the tolerance or the literacy of our rulers. I'm not sure which it was. Either politicians in those days didn't read, or they genuinely had a broader mind and a greater willingness to accept this kind of liberty being taken with the sort of sacrosanct heroes of our mythology and our history. And so the book is today, I mean, it had 45 or 46 reprints before a new Silver Jubilee edition came out in 2014. And touch wood, it has had a very long life, and it's found a new generation of readers now. So, but I wonder if that book was published today, whether I would get away with it. I think probably it will be far more difficult to get away with it. I think it would be ridiculous for someone to try and ban it now, when it's been around for 26 years. But a new book that does something similar could well run afoul of the moral policing we're seeing increasingly in our society. So I'm sorry to say that the only answer to your question is we all have to stand up and fight for freedom of expression. But it's not easy. And very often it's those who threaten to disrupt the peace, to break down law and order in protesting against rights. The politicians and the governments tend to run to appease them, rather than say that they will defend the right of freedom of expression of the writer and will instead act against those who threaten that freedom. Instead, the instinct of politicians and many state governments has been to go off and curb the book or the work of art in order to preserve the peace. And I think this is a sort of lack of courage of successive governments that I personally rather deplore.
Mr. Tharoor, this is Rajiv Kumar Shukla. I'm a broadcaster and the writer. It was refreshing, engrossing, and illuminating to listen to you. The inalienable right of every writer to choose the language he or she expresses himself in is definitely there, and all the respect and regard for that. But when you say that the Indian reality is expressed better in English than in any of the languages of India,
the pan-Indian.
Are you that familiar with the contemporary and writing being done in Indian languages?
Only in translation. That's a very fair question. What I said was that it's the pan-Indian urban reality that is better expressed simply because every language in our country is geographically confined. So to describe the Indian reality in, say, UP or Bihar, there's no better language than Hindi. To do so in depicting a slice of life in Kerala, there's no better language than Malayalam. But if you want to talk about a pan-Indian experience, such as the Great Indian Novel tries to do, English is unparalleled simply because if I chose any one of those Indian languages, not that I could write as well in any of them, but if I could, and I chose one of those languages, I would automatically be limiting both the terms of engagement with my subject as well as the audience and the assumptions of the audience engaging with it. So someone like me can write for others like me who've grown up in Bombay or Calcutta or Delhi or Bangalore or Amritsar or Madras or Coimbatore or Kochi, and they'd all have a certain common cultural matrix through the English language which will enable them to appreciate what I'm trying to say. And Chetan Bhagat has done the same with, if you like, Patna and Ranchi and smaller towns whose readers he has reached through appealing to their experience of life through the English language. But if you were to write about, if you were to write in Malayalam, you will not be able to reach that reader in Patna in quite the same way. If you see the distinction I'm trying to make. You'll have to get that Malayalam novel translated into Hindi, where already something would be lost. Whereas if you write as Chetan Bhagat has done about the small town Indian student going to coaching classes to sit for an IIT examination, that's an experience that is shared by a similar student in both Kochi and Ranchi. So you see what I mean. The pan-Indian experience is better communicated in English because it is the only pan-Indian language. It may not be true 50 years from now. I have often argued with Mulayam Singh ji that Hindi is succeeding and progressing in our country thanks to Bollywood, not thanks to government diktats and imposition of rules and laws. That if you try and force Hindi down people's throats, it will not succeed. But if you allow it to grow organically, more and more people will learn it and use it and be comfortable in it because they're enjoying it as a vehicle of entertainment. So maybe 50 years from now, I will not have to have this concern that I'm talking of today.
Sir, I'm Sujata Chopra, sir. I'm a bilingual writer. Sir, before writing anything, I think in Telugu and then I write in Odia or in English. Sir, my question is, you think in English or in Malayalam, sir?
I think in English largely because I was really brought up in English, with English as my first language, at home, at the playground, at school, with friends and so on. Because, my parents were both born in Kerala in villages and went to Malayalam medium schools. But then my father migrated to England as a student. English then became the dominant language. I was actually born in London. They moved back to India when I was just 2.5 years old. I grew up in Bombay where most of my friends were not Malayalis. In fact, I don't think I had a single Malayali classmate. So I spoke to them in English and they spoke to me in English. And then we moved to Calcutta for high school. Then I came to Delhi for college at St. Stephen's. And so ultimately English became the common language that I took with me everywhere. I dreamt in English. I wooed the ladies in English. I fought with my friends in English. I acted on stage in English and so on and so forth. Having said that, it's also true that when I, for example, try and imagine a Malayalam-speaking character, even if I'm rendering his or her thoughts in English, I would try and imagine them thinking aloud in English, in Malayalam, or speaking a Malayali inflection in their English. And the similarly thing with Hindi. In my novel Riot, I've very consciously made an effort. As I mentioned in my speech, there are 12 or 13 different narratorial voices in Riot. One of them is a Hindutva leader in a Hindi heartland state. And it is understood that he's actually speaking Hindi, but his words are being translated for the benefit of the reader. So the cadences of what he says are very different from a sort of Stephanian-type educated IAS officer who's also a character in the book, which in turn is different from an American girl who's a character in the book, and in turn is different from a sort of lower middle class clerical level kind of Indian official who's speaking English to a foreigner and doing so in a slightly fractured English. Each of these different kinds of English styles is different and bears upon it the inflections of that person's native way of speaking. Now, it was not easy to pull off, and some may argue I didn't succeed, though in fact most people do tell me that the different styles worked for them. But I would urge you to pick up the book and see for yourself what I've tried to do. And I believe it can be done. Now, you can go to the other extreme, and I don't know if you've read G.V. Dasani's famous classic All About H. Hatter, published in 1948, where the entire novel is written in a sort of pastiche of Indian English, which in some ways is funny, but to me ceased to be funny after about 20 pages. It just became too difficult to get in. But you know, language is a legitimate ground for experimentation. My son was reading the other day a book entirely written in what the writer today imagines would have been the Old English of what, the 10th century, was it? Of 10th century England. And it incomprehensible, the words, the sentence structure, everything incomprehensible. I tried to read 2-3 pages, gave it up and said, this is not worth it for me. But he found it fascinating, and I'm sure that in some ways you can do that. But again, to me, that's part of the joy of the English language. It has been used by so many different people in so many different ways that the pleasure of using it is enhanced that way. देखिए आप बैक को भी जाना पड़ेगा after this gentleman, because पीछे 3-4 लोग खड़े हैं आपके माइक के इंतजार.
Yes, I'm Tharoor Sahitya, independent scholar. Pleasure to hear you out. I had 2 questions. One was with respect to the great Indian novel. When you were writing it, were you also sort of thinking of yourself as writing a national allegory? I know this term perhaps has been overused, but insofar as it was a conscious kind of thought in your mind to speak on behalf of, if you like, the urban India, but was there an idea of India, an idea of the nation in underpinning the sort of initiative of writing such a novel which had a certain kind of overarching pan-Indian ambition? And now that you look back to it retrospectively, do you think that there were certain risks which perhaps you managed to successfully deal with? And the satirical impulse was also very interesting because it also sort of reached right up to the emergency at the moment of the sort of imperiling, if you like, of some of the initial impetuses which we associate with the formation of our nation. The second question was with respect to the moment of your college formation as a writer in the making, whether the Stephanian school, if one may describe it, the sort of writers emanating from Stephens of that generation, did actually sort of share a certain kind of satirical sensibility, a certain kind of irreverence, and was that crucial to your own self-promotion? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on the first one, the answer is yes. I was consciously writing. I mean, I've been writing from a very young age. My first short story was published when I was barely 10 years old, and I'd kept writing stories for Indian magazines and so on. But when I embarked upon a novel, I did have an ambition. Frankly, one of the things, especially for a part-time writer, somebody who's working a long day and then coming home and writing at night, there was very much the desire to, I mean, you never knew whether you'd actually write something that anybody would publish, and then you didn't know whether you'd ever write another one. So one tries to put everything in it. So a lot of my fundamental beliefs, shaped by my undergraduate study of history, my graduate study of international affairs, my passionate interest in Indian mythology as well as in Indian history, and my contemporary Indian politics, of course, all of that got infused into this one novel. It became both a sort of national allegory, as you put it, as well as sort of my laying out of my sort of view of the world, practically, or of India. Therefore, it became, because I chose satire deliberately. I'd always been very, very fond of humor, not satire per se, but humor. Complete and totally committed devotee of P.G. Woodhouse. And I lamented the fact that in Indian writing to date there had been none. There simply hadn't been, with the exception of Desani's book, which I found slightly odd anyway, any genuinely funny Indian writing. So I was determined to get some humor into it. And I thought that satire would be a very good vehicle to deal with such momentous subjects. You know, obviously I was going to be accused of irreverence. I was going to be accused of disrespect to the national leaders, whom I was reinventing as characters from the Mahabharata. And there was always the risk of being also accused of sacrilege, except that my argument was the Mahabharata is a secular epic. The only divine character in the Mahabharata is really Krishna, and I treated him very gently. Whereas the Ramayana is a sacred epic, and taking liberties with that could be considered sacrilege. So I did try and draw that distinction in my own mind between one and the other. And I would say that satire worked very well. I mean, especially the use of light verse and doggerel gave me great experience dealing with issues that were so portentous and serious, and then transitioning into something else. Verse worked, and I chose verse. Why? Because the Mahabharata itself is a poem. It's the world's longest poem, 5 times the length of the Bible. But most people have been defeated in attempts to translate it into poetry. They've all reduced it into summaries in prose. The only attempt that was made to translate every word of the Mahabharata in poetry by J.A.B. Van Buchanan ended when 22 volumes into what would have been a 25-volume endeavor, he died. It's such a mammoth task to undertake for a scholar. Professor P. Lal did the wise thing. He started doing translations of bits and pieces. And he did a few volumes, but again didn't get the whole thing done. But he did a 1-volume transcreation, as of the Mahabharata in very racy modern prose. And he wrote a compelling introduction in which he said that the essential Mahabharata is what is relevant to me in the second half of the 20th century. If it doesn't matter to me now, it's nothing, it is dead. And I found that very interesting and provocative an idea. And I have used it in the epigraph of my book, as I took that whole notion and made the Mahabharata into a 20th century story. Now I might add on your second question, if I remember it right, the Stephanian irreverence. Yes and no. The Stephanian writers within college, there were many who subsequently went on to become published authors. There's Rukun Advani, Alan Seeley, Amitabh Ghosh, Anurag Mathur, who am I leaving out? Ubhamanyu Chatterjee, all within a span of about 6-7 years of St. Stephen's College. Alan Seeley was the senior most of us, I think, 2. Ubhamanyu, I think, passed out in 79 or 80. And in that decade, you have 6 authors who achieved tremendous amount of recognition and success as Indian writers in English. But if you read them, you'll realize they don't have anything in common. I don't even know if they did much writing in college. Amitabh Ghosh, I can't even remember him contributing to the college magazine. He turned out to be a wonderful writer. So it's not necessarily college that shaped his writing. It shaped his sensibilities in other ways. But the notion of a Stephanian school of literature that some actually posited, I think, falls afoul of the fact of the absence of a common set of preoccupations, themes, or writing styles. Everyone has written very differently amongst the 6 names I mentioned to you.
Hi sir, my name is Saral Sharma. I'm an MPhil scholar at Delhi University. I mean, because you mentioned Professor Harish Trivedi's name.
He teaches you this?
Yeah, he taught me rather. So I want to ask you this question.
Listen, by the way, I've only read him, so.
You mentioned the Chetan Bhagat and Amish Trivedi. Tripathi, sorry. So don't you think, as now we are in the second decade of 21st century, we have moved on from Chetan Bhagat and Tripathi as well? The reason being, what do you think, changes have happened in the age of Twitter and Facebook in the art of writing? Because I can see even Chetan Bhagat is glued to Twitter nowadays, right? One question. Because I asked you this question because I'm associated with an initiative, Indo-Pak Peace initiative, which is Agaz Dosti. So what we guys do, we write. From Pakistan, students from Pakistan and students from India, we just write. We share our blogs, writing, etc., etc. So do you think, the art of open writing, open letters, blogs and articles has also, I mean, come under this broad spectrum of Indian English writing as well. Okay, and then the second, and I mean, what I thought that somehow you agreed to the notion of Roland Barthes, the death of the author. So, I mean, what do you have to say about that as well? Thank you.
Okay, now listen, as far as the question of whether literally speaking blogs and tweets and so on also part of Indian English writing, of course I would agree that all writing in English by Indians can qualify, but I did confine myself in my talk to fiction specifically, and I think it was easier to develop the argument and the thesis on the basis of fiction. Second, you asked whether Chetan Bhagat and company, Amish and so on, whether we move beyond them. I wouldn't say so. The publishers wouldn't be giving them these fat multi-crore advances, and they wouldn't be selling the kinds of copies they're selling even today. Amish has just embarked upon a new trilogy, of which the first volume has come out, and he's doing extremely well. And there are more and more writers coming. If anything, you know, what's happening is that popular Indian fiction of a kind that depicts a slice of the Indian reality that will not sell abroad and that will not perhaps even be published abroad is actually proliferating now. There are rom-coms and chick lit and dating novels and college experience novels, high school novels. There's just so much coming out, and there are so many books being published. I mean, it's remarkable, the explosion. I mean, when I published the great Indian novel, Viking Penguin was the only Indian English language publisher of any quality. There were a couple of Indian publishers who had mainly confined themselves to textbook publishing, with some occasional essays into fiction and so on, which are really not very good and poorly edited, poorly printed. There was, of course, there were two mass market paperback publishers in Jayco and Rupa, where they mainly published reprints of Western books, and that was it. Today, look at the number of publishing houses publishing original Indian work in English, and the proliferation. Every time I see a new publishing imprint coming up every other week practically, and new authors coming up, and the number of books is increasing exponentially. So I would definitely not suggest we move beyond all of this. I think, in fact, the horizon is widening and deepening rather than getting narrower. Your last question, the death of the author, no. I wasn't suggesting that. I was saying that to some extent, arguably, my text doesn't belong to me anymore. But what I intended to say is still what I intended to say. The words in which I chose to say it are my words, and the way in which my story told itself. And ultimately, interpretations are up to you. Once you have it, the text belongs to you. But I had to create it. Whoever has the mic, I'm not choosing.
नमस्ते सर, पहले तो मैं आपको मुबारकबाद देना चाहूँगा कि आज आपके जो न्यूज़पेपर नंबर टाइम्स में आपके व्यूज रहे, सुबह पढ़े तो इट वाज नाइस मीटिंग टू यू इन द इवनिंग. एक छोटी सी दुविधा है, मैं जानना चाह रहा था कि हम कैसे फिर इसको इन्वाइट करें. अभी आपने ये कहा कि आप जब भी अपने नेटिव प्लेस पे होते हैं तो आप मलयालम में बात करते हैं लोगों से, वहां के जो लोगों से हैं. हालांकि अभी आपने ये भी बताया कि आप बाय बर्थ मलयालम तमिल अपना वहां पे तिरुवनंतपुरम नहीं रहे, फिर भी सर आप जब नेटिव प्लेस पे जाते हैं तो वहां उन लोगों से इंग्लिश में नहीं मगर मलयालम में बात करते हैं. मेरा अपना पेन है कि हम हिंदी भाषी क्या करें कि जब विश्व में हम जापान, चाइना, रशिया जो कि हमारे बहुत अच्छे दोस्त हैं और विश्व में हैं, ये कंट्रीज सिर्फ अपनी मदर टंग के ऊपर ही मातृभाषा पे ही ये बोलते हैं और बात करते हैं, चाहे कहीं पे भी हो. हम क्या करें जो हमारी हिंदी भाषा कहीं पर पहुंच जाए विश्व में सर.
देखिए,
मैं एक सवाल और जवाब करना चाहूंगा सर. ये ऑनर की बात है. साहित्य अकेडमी ने देखिए सर आपके पीछे भी हिंदी को ऊपर रखा है, इंग्लिश को थोड़ा नीचे रखा है सर. आप बहुत अच्छा लिखते हैं सर, बहुत बात करते हैं, बहुत बढ़िया करते हैं, मगर कुछ लोग जो हम जैसे कुछ और भी हैं सर जो आपको उस एरिया में उतना नहीं समझ पाते सर. इंग्लिश अपनी जगह ठीक है, मगर हमारी दूसरी जो मातृभाषाएं हैं डोमेस्टिक जितनी भी हैं वो सिर्फ इसीलिए नहीं बढ़ पा रही हैं शायद कि हम लोग सिर्फ और सिर्फ एक इंग्लिश भाषा पे डिपेंडेंट रह गए हैं सर.
लेकिन एक लेखक
हम क्या करें सर उसके लिए?
लेकिन एक लेखक सिर्फ उस भाषा में बोल सकता है जिसमें वो लिखता है. तो मैं अंग्रेजी में लिखता हूँ, मैं अंग्रेजी में भाषण दिया. बात यह है कि साहित्य अकेडमी हर भारतीय भाषा में चलता है. मलयालम में भी साहित्य है. सुजाता जी, ओडिया में भी साहित्य, तेलुगु में ऑल्सो, डोगरी में भी देखिए, मतलब सस्ते कह रही है. तो इसलिए साहित्य वाक्य जो है तो भारत में ये इस्तेमाल करना बहुत अच्छा हो, ये संस्कृत से आया हुआ है और यही है सारी इंडियन भाषा। लेकिन बाकी सब जो आपको बोलना, अगर आप हिंदी में जाके चाइना पे भाषण दे तो कौन समझेंगे आपको? अगर आप जापान में जाके हिंदी में भाषण दे कोई समझेगा नहीं। ये सब अंग्रेजी एक सेकंड या थर्ड लैंग्वेज के रूप में सीख लिए। तो ये है, शायद वो लोग अच्छे अंग्रेजी नहीं बोलते होंगे, लेकिन अगर आपको अंग्रेजी भी आती है, अगर आप जरा सा अंग्रेजी बोल सकेंगे तो आपको एक कम्युनिकेशन माध्यम हो गया उनके साथ कि आप शायद आपकी हिंदी आपके अंग्रेजी से बहुत बेहतर है और उनकी जापानीज उनके अंग्रेजी से बहुत बेहतर है, लेकिन वो अगर शुद्ध जापानीज बोला और आप शुद्ध हिंदी बोले तो कोई आप दोनों के आपस में कोई कनेक्शन नहीं स्थापित हो सकता है। इसलिए अंग्रेजी की जरूरत है एज अ सेकेंड लैंग्वेज। अभी कुछ और भाषा भी हो सकता था। अगर 200 साल पहले आप डिप्लोमेसी देख लीजिए तो सारी डिप्लोमेसी न्यायतंत्र दुनिया में फ्रेंच भाषा में करते थे। 500 साल से पहले शायद पर्शियन सबसे ज्यादा इस्तेमाल करते थे, मतलब हमारे एरियाज में देशों के आपस में कॉन्टैक्ट मेंटेन करने के लिए। तो आप हिंदी को अवश्य आप डेवलप कर दीजिए, आप उसका पूरे मतलब कल्चरली लिटरली सब कुछ आप हिंदी में कर दीजिए। लेकिन नॉन हिंदी वालों या विदेशी या अपने भारतवासी जो हिंदी नहीं बोलते हैं उनसे कांटेक्ट करने के लिए कभी कभी आपको एक सेकेंड लैंग्वेज की जरूरत पड़ेगी। मैं कभी हिंदी के खिलाफ या मलयालम के खिलाफ नहीं बोलूंगा, तो सिर्फ ये बोल रहा हूँ कि एक एक्स्ट्रा भाषा जानना सब लोग कुछ।
Good evening. I'm a 9th grade student and my name is Himlata. I write short stories and poems.
Well done.
Sir, there is a question from my side, and sir, I'm an MUN participator. MUN is Modern United Nations in school level. Sir, there is a question. Sir, terrorism, as you mentioned, it is a disturbance for globalization around the world. On terrorism on the basis of religion, not only terrorism but racism, discrimination and many more other topics which are one of the major problems for globalization, secularism in India and other countries. So can literature be a major step to stop this disturbance which is leading to many problems? So there's one more question. So in Greek, school means a place where children enjoy and children wish to go daily. But sir, right now in 21st century, school has become a place like we don't want to go to school kind of place.
It was always the case, believe me.
So in Greek, a school was a place where we enjoy, but now school became a place where we cry kind of thing. So
I'm sorry to hear that. I think you've done very well at school, judging by the quality of your questioning, Hemlata. But the truth is that all school children used to look forward to holidays. You know, something unexpected happened, the school day was off, everyone was thrilled. That's normal, partly because anything that is compulsory, that is regimented, that involves effort and work and discipline, all human beings tend at bottom to rebel against that kind of thing, so it's not surprising. But later, when you become older, you look back on your school days with a great deal of affection and nostalgia. We've all done it. I went to school many, many years ago, and I remember how happy I was when there was a school day off. You know, people who are older than you, like my son sitting here, they will tell you that I'm sure they too weren't always thrilled to be in school. But they look back on it, they've learned a lot. Again, it's helped them become who they are, and it'll help you become who you are. So don't worry about it. On your first question, you know, I'd like to believe that literature can help. I think it can help general populations. That's why I made the point that literary imagination, if only we've been able to get people to read more and understand more of other societies, other cultures, see other human beings as essentially no different from themselves, that perhaps the kind of murderous hatreds that were unleashed could have been prevented. But I say could, because first of all, men of violence don't necessarily read. That's one can be an idealist and hope that one, but they won't necessarily read. They will necessarily, they may go out and do the damage they do without, frankly, allowing their imaginations to go and embrace the possibilities of understanding and togetherness. And therefore, for me to say that literature could be an antidote, it could be, and if a large percentage of a population is well-read, cultured, it may be less immune to the virus of violence and hatred and more resistant to offering support and succor to these people. But sadly, we know that a terrorist who watches a Bollywood movie and enjoys it will not hesitate to put a bomb in that theatre, as has happened in Delhi, as has happened elsewhere. And therefore, for us to think that culture alone can counteract the impulses that lead to terrorist violence might be a little naive or idealistic of us. Sorry to give you such a realistic answer, but that I think will have to be the truth.
So we are extremely thankful to you because we had a great, you can say great evening today. It's a kind of feast that you have given to us, and we are thankful to the audience for their very live deliberation they had. Lecture as well as the other part of this question answer session, both equally we all enjoyed. Once again, thank you for coming to the Sahitya Akademi, and we hope that in future too you will never say no to our invitations. So you have to promise today that.
I've never been nominated for anything by the Sahitya Academy. I guess when this award democracy happened, had you given that your award, I said I never got an award. But I have been invited to speak. This is now the second time, and I'll be very happy to
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You remember that? Of jail.
Second lecture, that's what it is. We are serious people.
Sir, this side.
देखेगा कोई